Hello and welcome to Dissecting Philosophy with Dr McDonald. In this episode, I'll be reading and discussing the section of the Apostates in Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra, and I also have a wee discussion of Neil Gaiman's American Gods to accompany the section. So let's get started. Of the Apostates. Section 1. Alas, everything that lately stood green and motley in this meadow already lies faded and grey, and how much honey of hope have I carried from here into my beehives? All these young hearts have already grown old, and not even old, only weary, common, comfortable. They describe it. We have grown pious again. But lately I saw them running out in the early morning with bold feet. But the feet of their knowledge grew weary, and now they slander even their morning boldness. Truly, many of them once lifted their legs like a dancer. The laughter in my wisdom beckoned to them. Then they considered, and now I have seen them bent to creep to the cross. Once they fluttered around light and freedom like flies and young poets, a little older, a little colder, and already they are mystifiers and mutterers and stay-at-homes. Did their hearts perhaps despair because solitude devoured me like a whale? Did their ears perhaps listen long and longingly in vain for me and for my trumpet and herald calls? Alas! They are always few whose heart possesses a long-enduring courage and wantonness, and in such the spirit too is patient. The remainder, however, are cowardly. The remainder, that is always the majority, the commonplace, the superfluity, the many too many, all these are cowardly. He who is of my sort will also encounter experiences of my sort, so that his first companions must be corpses and buffoons. His second companions, however, will call themselves his believers, a lively flock, full of love, full of folly, full of adolescent adoration. He among men who is of my sort should not grapple his heart to these believers. He who knows fickle, cowardly human nature should not believe in these springs and many-coloured meadows. If they could do otherwise, they would choose otherwise. The half and half spoil everywhere whole. Why complain because leaves wither? Let them fall, let them go, O Zarathustra, and do not complain. Rather blow among them with rustling winds. Blow among these leaves, O Zarathustra, so that all that is withered may run from you the faster. So the section, the apostates, then, an apostate is somebody who has had either a religious belief or a political belief and then renounces it. And so, kicking off the section, we have Zarathustra have this whole relation into himself and his own teachings being like that of honey and beehives and so forth, and enabling them to become more critical and therefore develop their own critical thinking and try to encourage everybody to think for themselves. And then immediately after that, we have this whole relation into piousness, and being pious and having belief sort of strips the life away from people and makes old people out of basically the young. That whole idea of just sapping the very life out of youth itself coming out of there. And the main problem that sort of developed out in the first part is this whole relation between having renounced one's belief but then still wants to go on into another form of believing in something else. And so we have that whole relation into, well, suddenly once they have that whole renunciation of belief, they're like dancers, and they have that whole laughter and his wisdom that's beckoned to them and so forth. But now, as he says, now they're beginning to creep to the cross. Does that mean in the sense of they're going to become religious again? Perhaps. And of course, that's one of the things that could happen is somebody renounces their faith and then goes and then reaffirms it and then comes back to it later on in their life. Of course, that's always a possibility. But here, it's really the sense of, well, once you have that whole renunciation, you still have that whole habitual relation into the way in which worship and idol worship and belief itself and its performance takes place. So even though you've not had it in relation to specifically either in a religious or political context, let's say, it's still going to be shifted towards something else. And a good general sort of example for this is the way in which people worship celebrities, and musicians is a great example of that. When somebody fanatically worships a specific musician or a specific band, it's in that style of that religious context of having complete belief in everything that they produce, and therefore worshipping the musicians themselves above and beyond their sort of regular stations as whatever it would be as a singer or as a guitarist and so on. Suddenly they become just more than that, and they take on this whole idolatry level of worship. And a good societies as well in which you can pick up upon that, and this whole idol culture is within Japanese society, when we have that relationship in between the pop idols, as well as within Korean society as well, within the pop idols there. And it's very much encouraged that the people who support whichever set of musicians or idols is there then goes and indulges in this whole religious style of buying everything that's released, and then also trying to get your hands upon absolutely everything, including all just little bits and bobs, and then also buying such things as just pictures of a person and so on. And so we have this back into the section where we say, well, here we have people who have ultimately renounced their belief, but they're looking to then go and believe in something else. And what they want exactly is the problem. What is the thing that they want to believe in? And what's interesting here is that Nietzsche really starts to pick at the psychological makeup of these people and to say, well, what type of people are they? We have on the one hand, he says, a bunch of people who are courageous, want to sort of make their own way in the world, try to think for themselves, carve their own path. On the other hand, we have this set of people who are still very much in this whole sense of herd mentality. So even though that you've renounced your belief, you're still going to go along with this whole sort of herd mentality about things. And then he says this whole idea is cowardly. Why is he so harsh here to say, well, it's cowardly because they don't have that same sense of wanting to develop themselves, develop their own critical thinking and so forth, develop their own perspectives, and all what they want to do in every given context is to be always told what to think, how to think, and have all that process done for you, and therefore just bask in the reassuredness that comes along with the whole process of worshipping and believing in something. And this goes into the last little part for the first section, where we have Zarathustra saying that what sort of followers do we get? On the first hand, we have corpses and buffoons, ultimately people who are like zombies or are buffoons or idiots. So we have this whole relation between the first type of people that will come along are either those zombie like people or the ones who take what you say and then completely twist it around and completely get it wrong altogether. And we've had, of course, the wonderful interaction between Zarathustra and the buffoon in the last section, where we had Zarathustra quite harshly correct the buffoon because he had precisely taken Zarathustra's teaching and then used it in a completely negative aspect, solely focusing on just the criticism and skepticism without actually trying to develop anything positive out of it whatsoever. And then we have the second set of companions, as he says, once we get past these zombies and idiots, is that we then get into the believers who are going to then worship you wholeheartedly. And then he says, well, these people you have to ultimately take a pinch of salt with. These are the people who are, again, cowardly, herd-like, and just want to be told exactly what to do. And it's that wonderful line as well. If they could do otherwise, they would choose otherwise. The half and half spoil everything whole. Why complain because leaves wither? And it's precisely that point that Nietzsche wants to get to, that you should choose otherwise for yourself. But that's where the whole problem is, of course, is their psychological makeup, is they don't want to choose. They want to have the choice already made for them. And then we can read the line, why complain because leaves wither, a little bit more in depth, because when we think about especially the religious or spiritual mindset, we could say, well, what does it focus upon? Is all this emphasis upon death and suffering? When we have the nice sort of contrast to this that Nietzsche's sort of saying here, well, why complain because leaves wither? And what is exactly it saying at a deeper level is that we've got to affirm change and we've got to affirm fate and chance and things that happen in the world. Does that mean, therefore, you just pass everything off in a very, like it doesn't affect anybody whatsoever? No, but it's to affirm such things take place and that it's a necessary part of life itself. Rather than to always just solely focus on it, is to rather than focus on just the negative process of it, to then try to say, well, yes, it is something that's horrible, but it's all just a part of life itself. And therefore, we're able to move into a much more healthier mindset and positive outlook as well. So continuing on then into section 2. We have grown pious again, thus these apostates confess, and many of them are still too cowardly to confess it. I look into their eyes, then I tell them to their face, and to the blushes of their cheeks. You are those who again pray, but it is a disgrace to pray, not for everyone, but for you and me, and for whoever else has his conscience in his head. For you it is a disgrace to pray. You know it well, the cowardly devil in you who would like to clasp his hands and to fold his arms and to take it easier. It was this cowardly devil who persuaded you there is a God. Through that, however, have you become one of those who dread the light, whom the light never rests. Now you must stick your head deeper every day into night and fog. And truly you have chosen well the hour, for even now the night birds have again flown out. The hour has arrived for all people who fear the light, the evening hour of ease, when there is no ease for them. I hear and smell it. The hour for their chase and procession has arrived, not indeed for a wild chase, but for a tame, lame snuffling, soft walkers and soft prayers chase, for a chase after soulful hypocrites. All mousetraps of the heart have now again been set, and wherever I raise a curtain, a little night moth comes fluttering out. Has it perhaps been crouching there with another little night moth? For everywhere I smell little hidden communities, and wherever there are closets, There are new devotees in them and the atmosphere of devotees. They sit together on long evenings and say, "Let us again become as little children," and say, "Dear God," ruined in mouth and stomach by the pious confectioners. Or they observe on long evenings a cunning, lurking cross spider, which preaches prudence to the spiders themselves, and teaches there is good spinning under crosses. Or they sit all day with fishing rods beside swamps, and for that reason think themselves deep. But he who fishes where there are no fish, I do not call even superficial. Or they learn to play the harp in pious, joyful style with a song poet who would like to harp his way into the hearts of young women, for he has grown weary of the old women and their praises. Or they learn to shudder with a learned half madman who waits in darkened rooms so that the spirits may come to him, and the spirit has quite departed. Or they listen to an old roving whistling tramp who has learned from the distressful winds the distressful tones. Now he whistles like the wind and preaches distress in distressful tones. And some of them have even become night watchmen. Now they know how to blow horns and to go around at night and awaken old things that have long been asleep. So then, kicking off the start of the second section, we have again Nietzsche pick upon the psychological makeup of those people who once believed. And so we have that fantastic sentence that opens it up. You are those who again pray. And it's again that whole idea here where we have the whole performance aspect of it. And to say, well, even though that somebody doesn't believe in Christ anymore, or whichever organized religion it is, they still go through all the performance of it. And we have this wonderful line as well. The cowardly devil in you who would like to clasp his hands and to fold his arms and to take it easier. And it's that whole aspect of, again, herd mentality, allowing others to think for you, allowing others to put their beliefs in place of what you believe, and that whole aspect of wanting to take it easy, therefore. And then we go through a really quite long list of the different ways in which the apostates that still perform in a way that adheres to herd mentality and looking for idols to worship or things to worship. And we have those lines as well. They sit together on long evenings and say, "Let us again become as little children," and say, "Dear God," ruined in mouth and stomach by the pious confectioners. What a wee line that is. So it's again really hitting on hard the point that what has exactly become ruined is the mouth and stomach. What is Nietzsche getting at by this statement? Is to say, well, what exactly has it affected is the taste. Taste for what? The world. Everything that you can enjoy about it, everything that you take delight in, has been soured from all that. They've said that everything bodily that's going on and everything within us in a desiring process is somehow harmful and negative for us. And so they've soured the very taste of the world itself by focusing on the soul and the afterlife. And every action you've got to do now has to go in towards making sure that you have the best afterlife possible. And what does Nietzsche say? Once you renounce all that belief, do you suddenly have a great taste for the world again? Are you suddenly, therefore, just able to think for yourself? No. Why not? Because you still have this whole relation into herd mentality and following whatever the preacher or minister or whatever it is has said. You want to have an ethical model to dictate what you do. And it's got this whole sort of parent and child sort of relationship that is also touched upon. Let us become as little children, in the sense of it's that comfort of having that model in the first place, of being like a child that's led along life like a parent. What's providing the parental model, of course, is precisely whichever ethical model that the organized religious model, or even in this given context, of whatever style of political model it is as well, that therefore leads somebody along in life. Therefore, if you suddenly just renounce all that, what do? You're like a lost child, basically, is what Nietzsche's saying. You're like a babe in the woods, ultimately looking for some other model to try and take you along by the hand. Why is that the case? Because you don't know how else to live your life, because everything's been set up for you and all this has provided stability. What do these models ultimately do then? Is what Nietzsche's saying, is that they provide this whole relation into parental care and caring for people. And then what happens when you renounce all that? We have suddenly the whole wanting to find for ourselves another model. And then he goes through all the different ways in which you have that, such as he says there, the learned half madman, or the old roving whistling tramp. Or they like to go and find some long hidden things that have been long asleep and dormant. So continuing on then, I heard 5 sayings about old things last night beside the garden wall. They came from such old, distressed, dried up night watchmen. For a father, he does not look after his children enough. Human fathers do it better. He is too old. He no longer looks after his children at all. Thus the other night watchman answered. Has he any children? No one can prove it. If he doesn't prove it himself, I have long wished he would prove it thoroughly for once. Prove it? As if he has ever proved anything. He finds it hard to prove things. He thinks it very important that people should believe him. Yes, belief makes him happy. Belief in him. Old people are like that. So shall we be too. Thus the 2 old night watchmen and like scarecrows spoke together, and thereupon blew their horns distressfully. So it happened last night beside the garden wall. My heart, however, writhed with laughter, and was like to break, and knew not where to go, and sank into the midriff. Truly, it will be yet the death of me to choke with laughter when I see asses intoxicated, and hear night watchmen thus doubt God. For has not the time for all such doubts long since passed? He who may still awaken such old sleeping, light-shunning things. With the old gods they have long since met their end, and truly they had a fine, merry, divine ending. They did not fade away in twilight. That is a lie. On the contrary, they once laughed themselves to death. That happened when the most godless saying proceeded from a god himself, the saying, there is one God, you shall have no other gods before me. An old wrathbeard of a god, a jealous god, thus forgot himself. And all the gods laughed then, and rocked in their chairs, and cried, is not precisely this godliness, that there are gods, but no God? He who has ears to hear, let him hear. Thus spoke Zarathustra in the town which he loved, and which is called the Pied Cow. For from here he had only 2 days to go before arriving again at his cave and his animals, and his soul rejoiced continually at the nearness of his homecoming. So then we have the whole relationship between belief and proof that takes place, where we have on the one hand the whole argument to say, well, prove it, as if he has ever proved anything. He finds it hard to prove things. He thinks it very important that people should believe him. Yes, belief makes him happy. Believe in him. Old people are like that. So shall we be too. And is making that whole point to say, well, let's not go with proof. Let's go back into belief. And it's that whole mentality again that Nietzsche's saying, that what we have to get past and try to combat in a way is that relationship between proof and belief. When we have that whole relation into proof, then we have that whole relation back into the world and scientific evidence and so on. And then on the belief side of things, of course, there's all that things called into question. And that's precisely part of the problem, is to say, well, once you come out of this whole model that's been set up for you, people are going to not go towards proof. They're not going to go towards the scientific evidence. They're still going to go back towards their comfort zone. They're still going to go back towards belief again. And then, quite interestingly, that rounds off the discussion for this section, we have quite a fantastic argument being made by Nietzsche to say, well, people can have belief. And of course, belief is a very powerful thing to have. But at the same time, gods fade away as belief fades away. And that's a very, very strong counter-argument to the whole argument based upon belief in faith in the first place, to say, well, belief, we like to think, is something that's sound, and that ultimately gods will always exist. But here Nietzsche is saying, no, gods are very much a temporary thing, even though they can last for how much ever amount of years it is, and so on. They're only as good as the people that actually believe that they exist in the first place. And we only have to go back to old gods then precisely to start to see the problems of the whole idea of belief as something that's not absolutely sound, and that gods themselves are not absolutely sound either, in the sense of they're not going to be something that's going to be eternal, but rather completely dependent upon the society and cultures within given time periods. And a great example for that is, of course, the Greek gods. Because we could say, on the one hand, what does the Greek gods, Zeus, Apollo, Dionysus, and so forth, people all believed at one given point in time within ancient Greece that they existed. And within that, of course, you had the whole context about people's behavior and what to do and what not to do, and how do you worship the gods and so on, and that whole relation back into the afterlife and the ferrymen and the underworld within Greek myth. However, the belief in those gods, we can see, was very much limited to that specific time period, because of course now nobody believes in the Greek gods anymore. So what does this say at a fundamental level here? Is that ultimately belief is something that's very much dependent upon a society and a culture, and the whole models and the structures that exist are very much temporary, and so nothing is ultimately set in stone, and all the gods and everything that's set up in stone for now may not always be the case in the future. And so what does that do at a deeper level then, is to then question this whole relation into belief itself, and wanting us not always go back into that comfort zone that Nietzsche says, and that we've got to move towards a much more proof-based approach. But then, of course, we have that whole back and forth between proof and belief itself, even within the scientific community, in which certain people or theories are always held up with such incredible amount of belief and validity and so on, but even in those given contexts, they're only a temporary thing, because always can be disproved later on or called into question. But that's the whole point, is that we always want to have belief itself called into question, knowledge itself to always be in a very much progressive, moving forward process, because it allows for it to develop, allows for different ideas to take place. And so we could see overall for the section that the loss of God, or the loss of any particular belief in itself, even political belief, and a specific ideology is not as simple as just therefore within everybody's given mindset to move on to be therefore more productive, creative individual who could think for themselves. Nietzsche's pointing out actually no, what actually does happen is that people still have this religious mindset and psychology in relation to this herd mentality within all that, and then that's the thing that we need to try to tackle. To not always want to be led, to not always want to have this comfort, and therefore having other people always tell us what to think and what to do, but to ultimately for us to develop our own thoughts and think for ourselves, and therefore to be critical of what other people say and what they tell us to do, because therefore it allows all that lovely progression and development to occur. And so a great example for this section I thought was the novel, and it's also a TV series, American Gods by Neil Gaiman, that was originally brought out and publicized in 2001. And a little short synopsis of the plot is that it follows Shadow Moon, a man serving 3 years in prison who is given an early release. Shadow Moon is hired as Mr. Wednesday's bodyguard and finds himself in a hidden world where a battle is brewing between the old gods and the new gods. And so what's so interesting about American Gods is an idea as well as we have the old gods, such as Mr. Wednesday, who is Odin, the Norse god, and also we have various other different old gods within the story as well, all seeking worshippers and followers, and for them to ultimately still have power, whilst as people are now in contemporary society moved away from worshipping them into a new set of gods, which is, let's just go through the little ones that we've got here. So the new gods are Technical Boy, who's a new god of technology and the internet, personified as an adult-sized fat child. Media, new goddess of television and pop culture. She often communicates by hijacking whatever is showing on television. The Black Hats, Mr. Road, Mr. Town, Mr. Wood, and Mr. Stone, represent belief in conspiracy theories, taking the form of men in black. The Intangibles, new gods of modern stock market, their personification of the invisible hand of the market. Mr. World, leader of the Black Hats, and the new god of globalization. And then we have various other different new gods as well mentioned. So we have then the old gods want to still have relevance and power versus the new gods of technology, television, pop culture, conspiracy theories, and globalization. And it's just that whole really interesting aspect of here we have Neil Gaiman ultimately say, well, how exactly have we moved on in a contemporary society? Is that we've replaced these gods that people used to worship, but now they've been obviously being replaced with television and pop culture. And of course, the previous example in which people worship musicians and pop bands and so forth is such a great example to back that up. And what's so interesting about how it relates into the section is that it really touches upon that deep point that Nietzsche wants to make, that even without the religious context or even political context, that people will still go around in relation to wanting to believe in things, wanting idols to worship, and therefore still having that whole relation into herd mentality, because it's all that relation into comfort. What do people want is a nice, comfortable life, everything already done for them, thoughts already done, a nice model to live by, and therefore nothing to ultimately rock the boat. But it's of course those critical points we can then start to ask ourselves, and that's what's so good about the section as well. Well, what about when evidence rears its head that rocks that belief, that actually the thing that's been to be caring and loving for us, like this old parental model that's been taking care of us, but what about when it doesn't, or when the care is in fact smothering and harmful and so on? So, overall, great section then, tackling precisely the problems of belief. Once somebody proclaims that they don't firmly believe in whatever organized religion it is or political ideology, Nietzsche says, well, actually, that may be the case, but from a psychological point, you're still going to go through all the motions. Many thanks for listening to the episode. Feel free to check out my Patreon page at patreon.com/dissectingphilosophy. You could also donate me a wee coffee at ko-fi.com/dissectingphilosophy. Also, feel free to drop me a wee email. My address is dissectingphilosophy@gmail.com, and I can be also found on Twitter at I am a rubberman. Many thanks for listening, and I hope you'll join me next time.